All right. So, welcome back to the Inspire369 podcast. I have my guest, Richard Leviton, who is a trained clairvoyant, has worked with geomantic structures of the earth and angelic interactions for 40 years, and has written 35 books about it. So, welcome back, Richard.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we are recording this in January, early January 2025. What are your thoughts about the new year? Have you had any kind of, I know you mentioned you had a 7-day epiphany event that just recently ended. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
One thing I think we can expect this year is a continuing tug of war between the light forces and the dark forces, or if you prefer a more biblical language, the Christ versus Antichrist. It's only been 5 years since Earth reality has transitioned from the worst of the 4 ages, called the Kali Yuga, the Black Age, into the Golden Age, which is the opposite, the Age of Truth. And the Kali Yuga, sort of personified by what people usually refer to as the secret or world or shadow government and all of the dark agencies behind them and even various alien influences, are still struggling to hold on to their control. And at the same time, there's a kind of irresistible movement. It's sort of like a tide coming in of this golden age, the age of truth, Satya Yuga, changing the nature of reality and consciousness. So that kind of struggle will continue. Ultimately, the bad guys are going to lose because basically they're fighting God. I mean, Supreme Being invented the sort of rhythmicity to the ages of consciousness, and you can't really go against that. You can complain, but you can't win. As for the epiphany, that's a term from Christianity. It means the showing forth of the light. It's not well recognized in Roman Catholicism. Eastern and Greek Orthodox Christianity acknowledges it as a calendar day, which is January 6th. But I don't think they realize it's a live 7-day geomantic event in which the actual Christ, not the brand name product logo of Christianity, but the actual high celestial being that corresponds to that name. The Hindus call him Vishnu. Anyway, for 7 days, that celestial being tunes into a specific location on the planet, building up a kind of momentum of light and consciousness for the benefit of everyone on the planet, nature as well as humans, as well as what we call the light grid, which is a complicated geometric overlay of features that actually runs consciousness for the earth and people. And this year it was focused in Australia at a mountain in New South Wales, which, if you don't know Australia, it's the upper right, the northeast part of it. And it was pretty powerful. Each year, the agencies involved, that means a fair number of angelic families, the Great White Brotherhood, they sort of do like what they used to do with the Oscar Awards before they got a little weird. They would always try to outdo last year's presentation. So that's been the pattern with the epiphanies, where they sort of add more elements, add a little more complexity, overlap some things, presumably because they believe the earth can absorb it, can handle it. And even though most people are not in their daytime awareness aware of this event, it still sort of impinges on their etheric field, and you might say in a subliminal manner. So everyone gets a benefit whether they're aware of it or not. My job with some colleagues is to more proactively participate in it, because there's a kind of rule on the planet that some humans have to show up for every infusion of light. It isn't just like you expect your butler to bring it in and you take the tea. You actually have to participate in it. So some people have to participate in it. It has to be at least a minimum quorum of people. You don't have to be amazing or ascended or anything like that. You just have to show up with a good attitude and have some, well, you need some clairvoyant training, a little bit of knowledge. You need to know how to hold your attention steady, and you need to have some contacts in the celestial world. But, that's just part of the basic package of training. And then these are brought to bear on the site a couple hours a day for 7 days, January 6th being the peak. Starts on the 3rd, finishes on the 9th. So by the 6th, the 4th day, it's at the top of a parabola, and that's the strongest time. It's quite delightful. And here's the irony of it. People talk about, Christians talk about they're looking forward to the second coming of the Christ. The Christ has come 6,025 times already because the Epiphany started in 4000 AD, 4,000 years before the first coming. It's sort of somebody's idea of a joke. So it's actually been happening every year. And again, I emphasize when I use the word the Christ, I don't mean it the way conventional Christians do. It's not a person. It's more like a diffuse consciousness. A good way to sort of get a sense of that in a non-dogmatic or doctrinal sense is picture the Supreme Being for the moment as like a person, and the Supreme Being extends his or her, there's a Mr. and Mrs. God. I'm just going to say he for the moment, but they're both genders. Extends his hand and says, this is the Christ. In other words, it's one step down from the Supreme Being, but you step on the hand through the Christ and you come back to the Supreme Being. So that's a way of thinking of it outside of dogma. I hope that's clear.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. So the idea of Christ is interesting, and I've heard similar things about how that Christ isn't necessarily a person; it's an energy, and that it's very interesting. It's like there's debate on whether Jesus was real, right? Is there any evidence of actually an actual person named Jesus living in Nazareth in Israel or whatnot? But I don't know. I don't think that's an important question, right? Or the answer to that isn't necessarily important. What is important is that something did happen 2,000 years ago, or maybe it was an accumulation of something, right? That kind of spawned what we now know of as, what has become corrupted as Christianity as a religion. But the concept of Christ, of this Redeemer energy, is really interesting. But you said 4,000 years. It's been around for 4,000 years, right?
No, it started at 4,000 BC.
Okay, right.
Around for 6,025 years.
Oh, okay, interesting. So then why? So then that's always interested in me. I've always been fascinated by the history of Christianity and how, because there is a thread of Christianity from ancient Egypt, right? And there's a lot of similarities between the myth of Jesus and the myth of Isis and Osiris, right? And that kind of mythology. So it seems like Christianity can almost be considered a mystery religion in that sense, or an offshoot of an Egyptian mystery religion that spawned into what we now know of as Christianity. Is that an accurate statement, or?
Well, let's give them the benefit of the doubt that they started off that way. But as early as 300 AD, the Gnostics, who were considered the heretics by the Orthodoxy, were saying that the Antichrist had stolen their religion. So if it was a mystery religion, it was a black magic type religion, according to the Gnostics. Let me give you a different way of looking at this. In Hinduism, they have a model called the Dashavatara. It means the 10 descents. And they're referring to Vishnu, which I interpret as their version of the Christ, making 9 so far, and the 10th to come in the future, incarnations, at least metaphorically, for the purposes of helping the planet. And some of the earlier ones took the form of strange shapes, a fish that was 8 million miles long, a turtle, a dwarf, a lion. And then they moved into the more human personifications of Rama and Krishna and the Buddha. And then the one to come is called the Kalki Avatar, which is similar to how Islam, Persian mythology, Christianity have envisioned the final arrival of the Messiah, a guy with a white sword on a white horse saying, I'm going to fix the world and everything. But the principle there is that it wasn't just once. It's been 9 times so far, at times when the earth and human consciousness desperately needed what you'd call some rescue, a little rescue work. And the Hindu psychic model is so delightful because if you are clairvoyant, their images are so assimilable. They were just created by really talented clairvoyant people long, long ago. And the interesting thing is, because I asked myself this, how come Jesus didn't make the list? Well, two reasons. One, I think they stopped compiling the possible descent of Vishnu a long time ago, millennia, maybe even an eon ago. So it's a very old model. Jesus is quite recent, 2000. Second, well, Rabbi Jesus technically was a human incarnated person. And all those other descents of Vishnu, none of them made it to the physical world, except possibly the Buddha. But for most people, the Buddha is fairly austere kind of guy. I mean, I was trained as a Buddhist, so I don't have any problem, but I can appreciate how it might seem a little, not off-putting exactly, but it does require a lot. You have to meditate and face your shadow and do a lot of stuff that's not very pleasant. And not only that, Rudolf Steiner mentioned this, and I can confirm it myself. The actual human being who was Jesus was the temporary incarnation of what's called a Ray Master. This is a notch above ascended masters as part of the Great White Brotherhood. And that particular Ray Master was selected because the ray that he oversees, which is scarlet or red ray, is dedicated towards preparing consciousness to surrender its sense of self to the greater cosmic realities. It's sort of the real meaning of crucifixion. It doesn't mean your body dies. It means your sense of yourself dies so that you can have room for more. There's a saying, either Steiner said it or the angels I work with say it, I forget, not I, but the Christ in me. It's like you open yourself up to a bigger thing. Anyway, that's maybe more than you're asking, but.
No, yeah, it's fascinating. So the Great White Brotherhood, can you kind of talk about them a bit? How did they get started? Who are they? Kind of any more insights into that?
First of all, let me get clear on the nomenclature. Great means they're powerful, they're significant cosmically speaking. White means they have all ascended. That means they have changed their physical forms into bodies of light, and the purest form of light is white, hence they're white. Brotherhood means they all get along. They have a nice collegial network. Okay, it's a real thing. It's referenced in various myths. You just have to understand what they're talking about. For example, in Norse myth, they have a place called Asgard, which is the enclosure of the As. That's their name for gods. Well, that's the same as the name of the Great White Brotherhood. It's just they didn't have the words Great White Brotherhood. That's a theosophical innovation from 150 years ago. And technically, they're based in the constellation Ursa Major, the Big Bear, which is basically just the Big Dipper. And they're, I mentioned Ray Masters, there are 14 of them. They're like the major directors within the Great White Brotherhood. And what people think of as ascended masters sort of relate to them. The Ray Masters are their bosses, so to speak. And then the chief of the Great White Brotherhood is the Solar Logos, whom everyone's heard of, but they just don't realize who he is. And that's King Arthur, Indra, Thor, all the names of chief gods like that. That's just another name for the chief of the Great White Brotherhood. As to a working relationship with them, let's say if you are proposing to do anything significant in terms of helping the planet's light grid, which is, again, a way of referring to an overall geometric field of design with many, many what we call light temples in it. The light temple is, if you picture a place like Chartres Cathedral and then picture it as made of light instead of stone. That's what we mean. Or the Taj Mahal or any kind of places, hundreds of different types, but they're made of light, not matter. If you propose to help, shall we say, inculcate more light in that pattern, you have to be able to work with certain colleagues. You have to be able to work with the nature spirits, a couple families of angels, and some members of the Great White Brotherhood. Not all of them, but basically the Ray Masters come into play. I haven't had much to do with Ascended Masters. I sort of work with their bosses. And just to be clear on the rays all emanate from Ursa Major, 2 for each star in the Big Dipper, 7 stars. And they're like fundamental color-coded themes of consciousness that stream through the entire galaxy. If you were to say there's actually there's 14 technically rays. You would say there are 14 primary themes for consciousness, no matter what kind of body you're in, human, alien, whatever, but self-aware, intelligent, sentient would be the criteria. The rays are relevant. They sort of structure consciousness at a fundamental level. And so the ray masters are the people in charge of those rays. So it's a high level of responsibility and a high level of evolution that got them the jobs. And some of them are actually famous, though people don't know who they are. Apollo, Pallas Athena from Greek mythology, they're both ray masters. Jesus, who was Zoroaster in an earlier life, they're both famous, obviously. Magdalene, the famous, quote, whore of the Bible, which is really quite a nasty thing to say about her. But in the earlier cultures, she was Aphrodite, Hathor, and others, sort of almost like the original rock and roll goddess, because she's associated with music and love and erotic things. Although that didn't mean sex, it meant the magnetism that held the physical and the celestial world together. That was the original meaning of Eros. And her ray and her function was to sort of manage that. So I could go on, but maybe ask another question.
Yeah, sure. Well, so in relation to that, so what are the, when you're talking about angels, right, and ascended masters and their bosses, right? So the ray masters themselves, what is the hierarchy? What is the order of I guess, if that makes sense? Who's who in that kind of regard? Right?
I understand.
Yeah.
I often try to get that clear in my head too. First thing I'll say is, okay, I've worked with one family of angels for 40 years consciously, but apparently I was aware of them when I was a child, so you can add some decades to that as well. They're called the Ophanim. It's a Hebrew name. All the angelic orders got Hebrew names. I don't know why. I guess because the Jews were sort of monitoring the angelology compilations. So Ophanim means wheels. They're the wheels of the Supreme Being's chariot, otherwise known as the Merkaba. They move the Supreme, sort of like a chauffeur. They move the Supreme Being's energy through the universe, Ophanim. And those guys, they are the principal go-to angel family for anything to do with earth energies, geomancy, light temples, ley lines. That's just their job. Their consciousness has been instrumental in setting that thing up. And so anyone working with the light grid who has the intention of actually being effective instead of doing it on a fantasy level has to be able to work with them, which means you have to meet them and sort of get used to the protocols and be able to hold your consciousness at a level where you can meet with them. You're still going to be like a hobbit meeting with Gandalf or Aragorn. You're still not going to be some amazing prodigy of consciousness immediately, but you just do your best and show up and try not to do stupid things. And, they say if you take one step towards them, they'll take a 90 towards you. That's sort of the deal, but you have to make the one step. Okay. In all, there's 40 families of angels, not 10, 40. I don't have the impression all 40 are intimately involved in matters of the earth and the light grid and human consciousness, but at least 10 are, and I've had stuff to do with all 10. Some of the more famous ones are the Seraphim and the Elohim and the Nephilim. These angelic families, all of which the Supreme Being granted a gigantic number of copies. It's like they just got to keep their finger on the Xerox machine for like a week and just kept cranking out copies. Okay, so there's the angelic realm. Then there's the Great White Brotherhood. Then there's a third group called the Pleiadian Council of Light. I know the Pleiadians are sort of the go-to glamorous alien family, but you can put aside a lot of the nonsense said about them. Most of it's still true. They are a key player. The Pleiades, 440 light years away. Seems like a long way, but if you got a Stargate, you get there in two seconds. And there's something like the membership in the Pleiadian Council of Light is in the billions. So that means intelligent life forms from across the galaxy, totaling that. So, and some come from the Earth too. The Ophanim once told me there are 14 representatives from the Earth. I don't know who they are, but there's 14. So you put those three groups together, they all work in tandem or collegially or cooperatively, or they just sort of are assigned different areas. there are higher levels of oversight. There is, for example, a figure called the Cosmic Logos, who is the boss of the Solar Logos, King Arthur. And that term is not that familiar unless you've read theosophical books, but it means Logos is another name for the Christ or Vishnu. And solar means King Arthur can transmit the Christ at the level of suns, S-U-N, stars. The Cosmic Logos can transmit the quality of the Christ at the level of a cosmos. And then his boss is the Logos, which is another name for Christ, Vishnu, and all the different names for the Christ. And then the top boss is God, the Supreme Being, Brahma, Ptah from the Egyptian, lots of names. And the thing you also have to keep in mind, and this totally got edited out in the three religions of Abraham, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, all the deities have feminine complements with an E. In other words, complementary parts. Mrs. God, Mrs. Christ, all the archangels have a feminine component. The Elohim, for example, always appear as like kingly and queenly figures from out of old mythologies. It's always dual gendered. The Nephilim are dual gendered, not in an anatomical or biological sense, but in terms of a more abstract yin and yang, like active or passive. But it's still, you have to be very subtle in appreciating that. But there's always a Mr. and Mrs. And it comes all the way down to Gaia and Pan, the regents of the planet. You could say that's a Mr. and Mrs. And then every human is a Mr. and Mrs. in that, following the model of Carl Jung, a man has an outer masculine and inner feminine. Woman has an outer feminine and inner masculine. There's your Mr. and Mrs. So it's all the way down from the Supreme Being to the human. And that got totally edited out of not only the Judeo-Christian model, but pretty much the metaphysical model in most cases. And it's essential to recognize that. And then the real joke is that even that gender distinction is irrelevant because you're dealing with consciousness before it was ever gendered at all. So there's, I don't know, it's almost like there's certain levels of jokes that were seeded into the whole metaphysical model. And when you get to them, you say, wow, you kidding me? Is that really the story? So anyway, the principle is they all work together according to a plan. Where does the plan come from? Obviously, the Supreme Being in his sort of Brahma with the sleeves rolled up and the slide rule. I know it's an old image, but it delivers the point. And there's a group vaguely referred to in the book of Revelation called the 24 elders. But you get a better picture of them in the model of Jainism, Jain from India, where they're called the Tirthankaras, means the showers of the way, or the showers of the way across the river between physical world and spiritual world. And these guys live millions of years, according to legend, and they're the ones that sort of manage all the plans. You could say they're God's privy council. They manage the long-range plans, like a plan that will take an eon, a billion years to unfold. And then the Supreme Being as Brahma or Ptah or Vishvakarma, all these different, or even the Freemasons, grand architect of the universe. He's the guy who comes up with all the cool ideas. And even if he screws up, he can't get fired because there's no one to replace him. So it's kind of job security. That's another joke, because he has screwed up a few times. Anyway, that's sort of the setup.
Yeah.
And you sort of need, first you need to be aware of it. And second, you need to have at least provisional working relationships with some representatives of each group, because they're all involved. Why? Because people talk about activating sites, and it's really not the right term. It's not a binary on-off. It's a dimmer switch, a slight nudge. Realistically, you're only going to activate a site maybe 0.5% at a given time. If you activate it too much, it'd be like putting LSD in the public drinking water. Everyone will go crazy and have visions and not be able to make sense of them. It has to be a little bit at a time. And so what I say is there's 3 hands on the dimmer switch. Nature spirits, that means gnomes principally, are the earth element, humans, and the angelic - Great White Brotherhood realm. You have to have all 3 because it's hard to know exactly what the goal is. It's not like they'd give you a printout. This this is the total picture of what we expect to achieve by this sort of light infusion. You just get just a little bit. It's sort of not fully read into the program because either it's classified or we wouldn't understand it or they don't think we need to know. So you have to sort of accept that. But you don't want to be a cowboy and do stuff recklessly until you have a good sense of what, where, how, and who you're doing it with.
Interesting. Yeah. So we talked about in our email correspondence the planet Maldek, and you talked about how it was. There's a lot of theories about it if it actually existed, right? So for listeners who don't know, the myth of Maldek. Maldek was the planet that supposedly is the asteroid belt now, and that there's a lot of theories that perhaps they destroyed themselves. There's also actual science that says that in the formation of our solar system, there was at one time a planet that perhaps Jupiter destroyed, and scientists have actually mapped out the orbit of the planet of the gas giants, and that their orbits are actually impossible without the addition of that planet or some other planet besides what we have now, which is very interesting. But you mentioned that a geomancer destroyed the planet, and it kind of relates to what you were just talking about.
Well, it's an interesting topic. Maldek, yes, it was definitely a planet. It's between Mars and Jupiter. The asteroid belt is the remains of the planet after it blew up. And a guy named Bede, a couple centuries ago, worked out a mathematical theory explaining the necessary placement of the planets in our solar system, proving that there had to have been a planet between Mars and Jupiter. But metaphysically speaking, Maldek was the original planet designed for humans. Obviously, humans there would be physically a bit different from humans on Earth because Maldek's a lot further away from the sun, and there's all kinds of astronomical principles that would come into play, which scientists would know about, that would change, not radically, but somewhat, the actual physiology and appearance of the human. But putting that aside, what happened was the geomantic engineers, and I say plural, not just one person, it was a whole cadre. Think of it like the Army Corps of Engineers, and they screwed up. That's a way of looking at it. And the way they screwed up is, this will sound either funny or elitist, but they got bored with the slow pace of consciousness unfolding on Maldek. See, the trouble with humans is a supreme being creates a covenant saying, you guys, I'll give you free will, and I will restrain my angels and everyone else from interfering with you directly, and even the demons. Demons can seduce, but they can't directly like kick you or something. And the angels can't produce miraculous, what the Greeks used to call deus ex machina, when you had a play and the plot was so screwed up, they didn't know what to do. So they'd send down Apollo or Athena to sort everybody out. It's called a deus ex machina. It's sort of funny. But Streamy says, no, I'm not going to do that. But you guys, you have to sort yourself out. We can only nudge. So what happened is that the pace of evolution on Maldek, from the point of view of the geomantic engineers who came from planets whose life forms were much more advanced, and that included the Pleiades, which is a paradox because according to astronomers, the Pleiadian stars couldn't have existed then, but the Ophanin told me the Pleiadians came from many other places, including the Andromeda Galaxy, so we'll just not worry about that fine point. Nonetheless, they were principal among the geomantic engineers, and they got bored with the slow pace, and they got seduced by some dark aliens from somewhere else in the galaxy that sort of insinuated that it wouldn't be that hard to relocate the planet in a better zip code, so to speak, of the galaxy. If you think of what zip codes mean to people now, there's some really upmarket ones and some ordinary ones. So we could relocate the planet and get it to spin faster, if you like. And they might have spent 100 or 200 years feeding this sort of seductive thought into the engineers because they just sort of wanted things to move faster. And what happened was, when they attempted to do that, it messed up both the physical and geomantic aspects of the planetary grid. I should say that the physical aspects on Maldek was they had a hydrogen-based grid. And the hydrogen, quote, plants or facilities were in the same place as the major geomantic nodes, which is what we call sacred sites. So they had both in the same place. It'd be like putting, well, a nuclear power plant at Stonehenge. Not a good idea, but that conveys the idea, right? Juxtaposition of the two things. And the energies built up and imploded, and the planet blew up. It wasn't like somebody put a bomb into it. It's just that the energies got radically destabilized. So that created a problem, because where's all these now dead people going to go? Because they have their evolution interrupted through no fault of their own. They weren't seduced. It was the managers who were. So Earth had to be prepared. It was already there, but it had to be sort of tarted up for human incarnation. That took a while. And it sent another team there to spend actually 2 million years setting up the light grid and preparing all the facilities and calibrating them exactly to the parameters of consciousness that the Maldekian souls now occupying human bodies would require. You follow me? It had to be adjusted carefully. And they did. And the new souls incarnated. It was like the Maldekians plus a demographic group drawn from across the galaxy. And then life on Earth began with a new form of human beings.
It's very interesting. It's a story of Maldek I haven't heard before, because the one I'm familiar with is similar, but it's from the Law of One channelings, specifically the entity Ra. And if you're familiar with them, and they tell the story about how the planet blew up, but the inhabitants were in what they called a knot of fear, and that they were unable to be reached in order to reincarnate again into human bodies for quite some time. And so they, because everyone on the planet, regardless if they're innocent or not, were tied in together. And when the planet blew up, it was so traumatic that it took them many, many hundreds of thousands, million years or whatever to finally untangle themselves and begin to be reincarnated as humans. But it took quite a bit of time.
Well, that's actually consistent with what I just said, because it took, according to the Ophanim, 2.7 million years to get the light grid ready for customers.
Yeah.
So it would be like if someone died traumatically from a car crash, being murdered, or something very quickly, physically definitive. It is said in books about afterlife that often they have a long recovery period. There is a shock to the soul, or probably the same could be said of the people who died at Hiroshima and Nagasaki from the nuclear thing. That was even worse, because it vaporized their bodies, and God knows what it did to their subtle bodies. So it probably took those guys a long time to recover too. So it's consistent with what you just said. Just different language, different way of describing it.
Yeah, it's just fascinating. It's just, just thinking of it.
The good news is, how should I say, the Supreme Being, we can infer, stood back and let Maldek get blown up. The Supreme Being is not going to sacrifice another planet. It's sort of like if you have bad teeth and you keep having your molars pulled out, eventually you have no molars. So you have to preserve a few, so to speak, or else you have to have dentures. So in the same silly logic, Supreme Being said, well, I'm not going to allow the Earth to blow up regardless. Even though I said I'm not going to intervene, I can always contradict myself. Something like that. It's hard to speculate as to how someone like that thinks. I don't even want to be presumptuous to say I'm correct, but you could sort of make assumptions. You may not be totally off on some things like that. But the thing is, they're not going to let the Earth blow up. That I'm sure of.
Yeah, that's reassuring.
The incarnated replacement plan is handy. Mars, it's not right. Venus, forget it. And Mercury, now it's too close to the sun. So this one has to survive.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned Mars. I mean, there is, in the same channelings, they talk about how there was a population on Mars at one point, and they destroyed their environment. And the theory is, well, the myth, what they talk about, you can't verify anything, obviously, but they speak about how there was a cloning operation, and they brought up the Martians' population to Earth, and they reincarnated, they mixed with the population on Earth. And a lot of the conflicts we have is a karmic tie to the incident that happened on Mars. So a lot of the Martian souls incarnating on Earth are still in that warlike kind of mentality, and they still have like those karmic issues that they're working out. So a lot of the conflicts that we see, particularly in the Middle East, is at least according to the channelings, which is very interesting. Yeah.
Well, let me sort of modify that slightly as far as details, but not in terms of principle. I can't speak to anything to do with Mars. I haven't empirically validated it for myself, so I don't know if it's true or not true. So I can't really speak to that. But I do know that the Pleiadians, who were one of 8, shall we say, ET families who were instrumental in designing the Earth, the light grid, and the human genetic pattern and structures of consciousness and everything, but principal among them were the Pleiadians. The Pleiadians themselves were bifurcated. You could say there were good Pleiadians and bad Pleiadians. Or to use the biblical cartoon image, one was Cain and one was Abel. One was the good guy, one was the bad guy. And they did not resolve this fundamental dichotomy in their psyche, which had deep roots going back to their origin, which was eons earlier. They did not resolve it. It unfortunately got transferred into human consciousness, not in a literal sense in the genetic pattern, although there might have been an echo effect, but it was left for humans to sort of work out that dichotomy. It was like slightly unfinished. So it's the same thing you said. It's attributing it to a different agency. See, the Martians, whether what you're saying is accurate or not, didn't really have anything to do with designing the Earth, because that was a lot earlier. The Pleiadians did. Pleiadians existed before the light grid on the Earth was put in place, and they were instrumental, among others, in implementing all of its details. So that unresolved dichotomy got transferred into humanity. The Cain and Abel aspect, the murderous and the love, or however you want to describe the dichotomy. And people are still working it out, or the culture, the collective of humanity is still working it out. Maybe not in a major forefront sense, but in the background, sort of in the subconscious, which is where, frankly, most of our consciousness is. We're about 5% aware most of the time, and 95% is dark matter and dark energy, so to speak. But
yeah, very interesting. So going back to kind of the idea of the Great White Brotherhood, the idea being, so I've heard that the galaxy has sectors that they're in charge of. So you mentioned Pleiades, Sirius, and other, and the Big Dipper, the Great Bear. Are other parts of the galaxy controlled differently, or are we not? Or is it galactic? Is it the entire galaxy? Okay.
Great White Brotherhood at Ursa Major is basically the organizing headquarters for the galaxy, all affairs on the galaxy. They can delegate. I mean, it's all a matter of delegation. Supreme Being delegates all the time, right? That's why he created all the angels, for one thing. And it's just sort of a couch potato, you might say. So, but the headquarters of the sort of organizing, cohering force of the Milky Way galaxy is Ursa Major via Great White Brotherhood. The thing is, and Ophanim always reminded me of this, we have to be careful not to transfer our notions of hierarchy, control, who's the boss, who's the person who is bossed, to matters at a celestial level. Is far more subtle. It's one image I came up with to account for that, especially regarding the 40 angelic families, because there's definitely a hierarchy of knowledge. Some families are more read into the program than others. If you picture a rose, a really complicated rose of like 40 or 50 petals, some of them are right close to the center. Some of them are on the circumference. Let's say the angel families like the Ophanim and Elohim that are close, are like petals close to the center of the rose. And so they are read into more aspects of the program. Doesn't mean they're better than the ones on the circumference. It just means that's the job they were assigned, right? So probably the same thing applies to galactic management. Again, it's probably, I don't think it's sort of, dictatorial and really hard and tough and following rule books on a clipboard or anything. There's probably a lot of latitude and experimental freedom going on, but overall, everything is coordinated through the Ursa Major.
The analogy of a rose is interesting. If you're familiar with Dante's Paradiso, he describes heaven that way, and the center is he called the yellow of the rose was the where God was. So that's very interesting. I like that analogy of the petals.
It works.
Yeah.
It delivers an idea.
Yeah. Well, let's shift gears a little bit, and I kind of want to go into the idea of myth and symbolism a bit. Are you familiar with Diane Fortune's book, The Magical Battle of Britain, at all?
Yeah, I think I've read that.
Yeah. Well, if for our listeners who may not be familiar, it's a book where she wrote. It took place in World War II, and it was a series of letters to other British occultists, which outlined techniques in spiritual magical work to defend Britain during World War II. And it was really, really fascinating because she was essentially doing magic, and she in her writing she claimed that there was a dark magician working in Germany, kind of doing the same thing, but she was working with symbols and myths such as the Arthurian legends, right, and using those to kind of build strength to build the resolve of Britain, and it was very, very interesting, and it kind of reminded me of the work that you do and you speak about in your book. And it seems like this is almost like working in the collective unconscious, right? So the work that you do and with the Great White Brotherhood, and it almost seems like you're diving into the collective unconscious and working in this very subtle space where it is a magical working. Would you agree with that?
Well, I would say it's more like diving into the architecture of the superconscious. In other words, if you say diving into the unconscious, it sort of hints that there might be manipulation or shady things going on. This is more like the light grid of the planet is the superconscious of humanity. It's sort of an architecture, an armature, a complete engineering blueprint for the complete possible evolution of human consciousness into its designed position. Sort of like armature is actually a good word for it. Diane Fortune is an important person. When I lived in Glastonbury, I used to walk by the house she used to live in. It was on the slopes of this funny old hill called the Tor that everybody heaped no end of attributions upon. Let's say, I don't think magic is necessary anymore, and maybe she just used that word because if she said geomancy or reciprocal interaction with angelic families, it would have been too obscure. But and also there's a question of, okay, well, as far as a technique, like in present time, you would work with landscape angels, potentially the egregores of countries. An egregore is a term for magic. It means watcher. But in geomantic terms, it means each country, like France, Ireland, America, England, has a kind of representative form. It starts out as a generic angel that then assumes a shape in accordance with the expectations and projections of the people there. For example, England's egregore looks like a cross between Boudicca, who is a fierce Celtic warrior figure from centuries ago, and Queen Victoria, which everybody has a picture of. France's is the rooster, which, hope I don't insult anyone, the strutting, cocky aspect of the rooster sort of fits that culture a bit. America's the eagle. Ireland is a female maiden. The name of Ireland came from that. Anyway, these figures, they're not really in any kind of sense a military angelic order, but they are available to marshal and direct consciousness among the elemental kingdom, the well-behaved dead people, as I like to call it. In other words, people who have died but have come back in the spirit form to help out, not to be a problem, but to help out. That's why I say well-behaved. But it depends on whether, how should I say, it's part of the plan that England should be preserved. For example, if you've ever read the Iliad and the so-called Trojan War, it's sort of funny little interludes in there. Zeus is hanging out nearby on Mount Ida, It's about 20 miles away from the supposed battlefield. And he's already decided who's going to win. The Achaeans from with Odysseus and Menelaus, they're going to win. The Trojans are going to lose. And Hera, who is Mrs. Zeus, so to speak, and Aphrodite, and I think Pallas Athena, all petitioned the old man to change his mind. He said, nope, made up my mind. This is the outcome. So regardless of whether you had any magic among the Trojans to protect the landscape, you were toast from the beginning because it had been decided. On the other hand, with England, it wasn't so much preserving England as far as the culture goes. It's more like the landscape. Because England, well, the whole British Isles were part of the oldest settled, geomantically settled part of the planet. They were part of a culture and a landscape called Hyperborea. It goes way, way back. It's before even Lemuria, which was before Atlantis. It's like eons ago. So, and not only that, it has the planetary umbilicus there. You don't want to mess with England because they're the caretakers of Earth's umbilicus. See, that would be the criteria. And then, and of course, the decision comes from on high, save or not save, right? And so it wouldn't be so much a matter of employing magic. It would be a matter of organizing enough collegial interaction, angelic realms, some Great White Brotherhood, Raymasters, some elementals, well-behaved dead people, humans, and sort of shoring up the light centers. If you have enough strong light, it could be strong enough to repel the dark forces that are behind, well, in the case of World War II, the Nazis. Yes, they were totally into black magic. There's a whole occult side to World War II. It's quite shocking or interesting, depending on how you look at it. So it's more like that approach. Plus, Dion Fortune was almost 100 years ago. World War II was, 80, 90 years ago? And things progress. New protocols are introduced. Humans become more competent at managing the protocols. Or just think of what computers have done since Mac first came out in late 1970s with their tiny little box thing compared to what we have now. Consciousness and the protocols for interacting with the light grid evolved just like that. So protocols from 100 years ago, with all due respect to them, may not be the best ones to use now. It's not an invalidation of them. It's just that there's even better things now, like the way they keep coming out with new smartphones.
But wouldn't you argue that there is a fundamental aspect to it, though? Like that kind of, I guess in terms of magic, right? So like when you talk about magic, a lot of magic, Western magic, is based on Kabbalah. And Kabbalah, is, at least Dion Fortune called it, like the yoga of the West. And it's one of the most comprehensive systems to understand these energies and so to basically understand how to work with these energies and what they are. And a lot of that informed a lot of the rituals that the Golden Dawn created and whatnot. And so it makes it effective for practitioners precisely because it's based on that archetypal understanding, right? Would you say that that's accurate, or how would you say?
Thing about Kabbalah is if you don't know Hebrew, you're sort of looking through a window at what magicians are doing inside the house. That's a basic problem. But putting that aside, I personally found it very helpful in terms of its metaphysical model, because a lot of it is actually applied in the structure of the light grid. For example, some of the quantities that are given in, let's say Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism. It's not really a complete distinction there. For example, Jewish mysticism says there are 613 mitzvot. Those are good deeds and bad deeds. A certain number of good deeds, make sure you do these. A certain number of bad deeds, don't do those. And on the one hand, it's a moral code. On the other hand, it's actually the reason for paying attention to that list is that you will eventually complete the cosmic body of what they call Adam Kadmon, which is like a cosmic version of a generic human, sort of. I mean, I'm simplifying it too much. And the 613, aside from being one of the very few prime numbers you find in terms of numeration for light grid quantities, is also the total of the different types of light temples on the earth. And the way the Jewish model fits the geomantic model is that when you sufficiently awaken enough light temples on the planet, you start to flesh out the Earth copy of that cosmic form. The Earth copy, among other names, is called Albion, although other cultures have their own names for it. That's just the English one. So the Jewish model there is actually quite accurate on a geomantic level. I don't know if the rabbis know that or not, but it's still a fact. So I found it very helpful. The thing about, say, building a metaphysical model is that you have to correlate data from multiple sources. You can't be a specialist in just one culture like the Celts or the Greeks. You have to shamelessly pilfer all cultures for data, for evidence, for like artifacts. The way I picture it is, let's say originally there was a unified body of knowledge, and analogically, let's call it the Tower of Babel. Forget what you think about it. We're just using it as an analogy. Everything it's like a master library for the planet. Then it got blown up. Bits went everywhere around the planet so that every culture or landscape, or every culture occupying a landscape, archived a few of the clues. They were good at it. The Hopis got some, the Navajos got some, the Greeks, Irish, on and on. You have to check all those cultures to collect the fragments and put them back together and build your own mythic Tower of Babel so you have a comprehensive picture of things. The existing metaphysical models, even theosophy, are incomplete. Steiner made a good attempt to recreate stuff, but he, well, for one thing, he died young, and second, everyone has blind spots. He left some stuff out. So you have to be able to put all those pieces together before you have a unified model. And when you do that, then you can start getting a kind of global sense of what's going on.
It's interesting when you study other religions and other spiritual practices, you do get insights into things that you wouldn't have had previously. So having, pulling from Native American myths and spiritual practices, and kind of correlating that with, Jewish mysticism and things like that is very interesting.
Let me add one thing to that. Yeah. You also have to be able to empirically validate it from your own experience. You have to see, does this actually play out in what I clairvoyantly investigate, experience, and interact with in the light grid at a given sacred site or a collection of sacred sites? A place like Sedona or Glastonbury has multiple features, for example, or any place in India. Does it actually play out in what I have observed empirically? If it does, then you can credit it. If it doesn't, it means there was some distortion, editing, redaction, or deletion in the myths or religions. You have to keep validating. It's not, you can't necessarily take it on faith as a scholar or as a mystic, because a lot of stuff has been forgotten. A lot was cut out. A lot was deliberately distorted. Look what they did to the Bible. How many rewrites they did on that, right? Compared to, it's sort of the legend of it. So you have to be able to validate it empirically before you can really trust it. And it takes a bit of work. And you need clairvoyance to do it, because if you can't see it, how could you check it out? You know what I mean? Because the myths and the numbers and the things referred to in the mystical traditions all have a reality, but they're not in the physical world. They're there's a lot of names for it: the astral plane, the etheric world, the spiritual world, the celestial world, lots of different names for it. That's where all that stuff is. That's where the myths actually take place. They didn't take place in the physical world. It took place in the spiritual world, as we label it. And you have to be able to investigate it on your own, or else you're taking it on faith. And there's a lot of disinformation out there. It's sort of like the espionage world. As John le Carré would say, if you trust the source, then you can trust the information. Well, you got to find the source first. Where is this coming from? And can you validate it?
That's very interesting. Yeah. And like, in Kabbalah, they talk about how Yesod and Hod and Nitzag form the astral triangle and the astral world. And that's where a lot of forms are created. But essentially, us in Malkuth, we can access, through our minds and our imaginations, these forms, but they're actually given life and archetypally from the higher Briatic realms, the ones closer to the source. And so you can find a lot of false illusions in the astral world, things that aren't, necessarily that aren't true. A lot of it comes from our emotional states, our imaginations, our fears and desires, and it populates the astral world. Whereas, the higher realms are the ones that contain the true archetypal forms, the ones that actually have impact and meaning, which is interesting. So, and so, it can be easy if you just focus on the astral realm, just to get lost in these kind of illusionary, like you said, deceptive traps, right? Deceptive myths that may not necessarily be true.
Sometimes they're deceptive on purpose.
Right. Yeah. Right.
Two different agencies. One, sometimes the good guys, the angel families, Great White Brotherhood, will deliberately distort something a little bit to test your discernment, because discernment's very important. And then on the other side, there's quite a large collection of what we'll call alien intelligences who have a real resentment about Earth and humanity, and basically have been mad at God ever since he came up with a stupid idea from their point of view. And so they will deliberately distort stuff to confound people, not to test them, just to screw them up. And then the larger way of looking at this comes from a Hindu myth about Krishna and his adroit ability to manipulate Maya, M-A-Y-A. Not the Mayans, but Maya. And people tend to interpret Maya wrong, like, oh, it's just a big illusion. That's not the way he meant it. Maya meant the complete protean malleability and fluidity of matter, consciousness, and light to create wonderful, delightful forms, and mystery forms and mystical forms. And there was a story where he entertained the gods, sort of like a juggler juggling 10 balls at once. And God said, wow, look at that. He's so talented. This Maya is astounding. That's part of the Hindu myth. And so that's sort of the larger picture, that once you get past the physical world where things seem to be settled and stable and not changing very much, right? I mean, a slow motion change, like the leaves come out in the spring, people die, people are born. But I meant like they're not going to shapeshift right in front of you. A few people might, but I mean, basically most people won't. That's part of the delight of Maya. But when you get beyond the physical into etheric, the astral, the mental, the causal, there's names for different realms, it's more pronounced. And a good example of that is the Ophanim that I work with. We call him Blaze for short. It's actually a name from the Arthur myths. Somebody that Merlin used to consult with, they called Master Blaze. So we agreed to call the Ophanim Blaze because it was more avuncular than saying Ophanim all the time. They have traditionally appeared in a number of metaphorical forms: elephant, bird, big monkey, Hanuman, horse. But ultimately, they have no form at all. So these are just metaphors to give you an idea of an aspect of our consciousness and potency. We are like an elephant charging through the jungle. We are like Hanuman, the giant monkey, roaring across the Himalayas. We are like a white-winged horse, Pegasus, or other ones flying people around the place. We're Ganesh, we're jolly elephants sitting on our butt making jokes, because they do make a lot of jokes, but they're all metaphors. In other words, the true form is formless. That's Maya too. The Maya is them appearing as Ganesh, the birds, the monkey, and all the other forms. But see, that's not meant to deceive anybody. It's just, we can't help it. We have to use metaphors because we don't ultimately have a form. Even the angel form is a metaphor. If you were living in India, they don't talk about angels. Their bodhisattvas don't have wings. They have bubbles of light around them. The same thing. For example, the bodhisattva Manjushri, who's the same as the archangel Michael, has a sword but no wings, doesn't have a shield, and he's got sort of bubbles of light and attendants around him. In the West, Archangel Michael is this blonde-headed, human-looking angel with a big sword and a shield. Same guy, just different way of picturing it. And they're both metaphors. The trouble is, the metaphors refer to something real, but ultimately, if you're God, they're metaphors. From our point of view, they'll seem really real. If you ever see an archangel, fairly vividly, they'll impress you with the notion that they're quite real. just not physically real. You can't go up to them and pinch their butt because it's not that palpable. But from the Supreme Being's point of view, they're all metaphors. In fact, I suspect from the Supreme Being's point of view, the whole creation is a metaphor. Like, it's like he's having a hallucination or an opioid dream, or he's in an opium den. I'm thinking of what kind of a universe would I create if I had nothing else to do? I'm being a little flip, but metaphor is a key thing you have to understand. And one final point, even the products of clairvoyance are metaphorical. For example, you look into the spiritual world and you see stuff, light temples, angels, all the rest of it. Your brow chakra, this one, which is like the flat screen TV that projects images, has to come up with plausible visual analogies to account for what is otherwise like a fourth dimensional or fifth dimensional energy field that is not necessarily as specific as I'm looking at you and you're looking at me. And so we have to come up with analogies, which is like saying, well, I'm seeing what looks like a structure, and it sort of reminds me of the Taj Mahal, and it looks like there's some beings that are angels there. It's all, you have to keep qualifying because you're never going to be completely right unless you're over there seeing it in person, in which case you're dead, you're not in a body, and you don't even care because it's part of your new environment. That's one of the paradoxes of actual clairvoyant training, is that you have to be prepared for the protean fluidity of images. You want to get it as close as possible, but it's still a metaphor. It's just that it's real as a metaphor, but it's not an absolute solid kind of thing.
Would you say that in terms of your experiences, would the metaphor be informed by your own personal, say, biases or anything?
See, that's where clairvoyant training comes into play. I had 10 years of clairvoyant training, sort of like going to college, get a PhD in it, so to speak. Yes, the subjective factor is always a problem, but a good clairvoyant training program will introduce you to the different levels of subjectivity and will help you clear out all the forces in your subconscious that will otherwise promote subjective interpretations to the forefront. Second, clairvoyance has to be conducted from the brow chakra and the crown chakra because they are subjectively free. They're emotionally neutral. Everything from here below has got an opinion, sort of like Congress or Parliament. Everybody's, well, we'll do this, we'll do that. I like this, I don't like that. Not ultimately, but in terms of our karmic abuse of the chakras over multiple lifetimes, they do tend to get filled with a lot of unwashed laundry, you might say, or unprocessed karma. So clairvoyance has to be conducted from up here, which is neutral. And then if I can compare this to disciplining dogs, when you tell a dog to sit, he sits. You tell your lower emotions to shut up, or I don't want to hear from you for a few minutes, they will. Otherwise, your clairvoyance isn't worth anything. So that's an actual criteria. Now, the trouble with people who don't undergo that training, which, by the way, is just another name for what the classical tradition would call initiation. Clairvoyant training is the same as initiation. It's just a modern term for it. And you develop the ability to see and to make changes, not just having a great TV. It's actually being able to change the programming, right? It's called like reality terraforming, you might say. So people who haven't had that training or don't think it's necessary and are, I don't mean to be snobbish, but merely psychic, there's no guarantee that their subjectivity might not jump in the forefront or be taken advantage of by low-level astral spirits pretending to be awesome and august celestial spirits. If you can't see them and you can't discern them, you are very easy to fool. This happens all the time. Again, it's just like espionage. You know, somebody's a mole, like in John le Carre for 30 years. You don't suspect that they're actually undermining your government until they're finally caught out. That goes on in the spiritual world all the time. If you can't discern your source, the epistemology goes downhill, or what do they call it? It goes pear-shaped, all these cliches for it. So
interesting. Yeah, so that's discernment is definitely...
One last thing. This is not a subjective factor, but based on the fact that when this is something you come to accept as unarguable, that people have had past lives, because this is fact. whatever you have learned and been exposed to, whatever images have entered your mental data bank, your picture data bank, these will be available as a kind of repertory of possible images for interpreting things. I'll give you an example. I lived with a very accomplished clairvoyant in England 40 years ago. That's where I sort of left Hobbit Town on the way to Mordor, so to speak. And I was total beginner on my part. And the Ophanim were visiting every night, and they're pretty much laying out the playbook for reality for us. It's quite exciting for a couple of years. And I raised a question because this guy, Geoffrey of Monmouth, wrote a book, The History of the Kings of Britain, in about 1100, said that Stonehenge had been in 2 previous places before it was at Salisbury Plain. Historians don't believe it, of course, but the Ophanim said, no, it's true. The second place was in Ireland. The first place was in Africa somewhere, but they could not tell me where because the name and the knowledge of it did not exist in my friend's brain or knowledge bank. They couldn't tell me because it wasn't there. 20 years later, a woman I knew who was brought up in South Africa told me exactly where it was. It was a game reserve in eastern South Africa. That's where Stonehenge originally was. It was in her data banks. Now, that's not subjective. That's sort of, if you went to college, what did you study? Well, I studied the classics. I studied Greek and Latin and all this stuff. So if someone mentions the Hyperboreans and Griffins and Herodotus, you know what they're talking about. If you studied chemistry, it might not register. So that's a factor too. See what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. That actually parallels the technique of channeling, because in channeling, there's 2 types. There's conscious channeling, and then there's trance channeling. And trance is a lot more dangerous, but it's a lot more, the fidelity of the channel is a lot more clear if you can connect with a higher energy. And so in the Law of One channelings, the raw channelings were a trance channeling, and they were higher. The fidelity was a lot clearer. It was a lot more specific information, whereas conscious channeling relies on the vocabulary, the knowledge, and the insight of the channeler, as well as the contact it basically it requires more work on the channeler's part in conscious channeling to interpret what's being said or what's being sent to them. So if they don't have a word for a concept, they can't explain it, they can't communicate it. So it sounds kind of similar to that, which is pretty interesting.
Let me comment on that. I would take the opposite view. I would say conscious channeling is epistemologically more dependable. Think of it this way. If you really want to channel correctly, that is a power of the crown chakra. It has to be developed and trained, calibrated, pruned, tested. And then it's like there's a microphone, let's say, and you're standing normally, you as a person are standing next to the microphone. You're used to saying stuff. It's more like your consciousness says stuff. And then there's a celestial agency, hopefully above the rank of the well-behaved dead, because you have to get above that rank before you can really trust anything. Let's say it's an angel, and they're going to step up to the microphone and speak for a while, and you're standing right next to them, wide awake, saying, sure, go ahead, say a few words. Sort of like, again, an Oscar presentation where the host hands the microphone over to a celebrity and says, say a few words, thank God and your family and all this usual stuff. But you're wide awake. And this was my experience with my English friend. The angels could ask him a question even while he was channeling them, and he could answer it coherently as a human being. And then he would step aside and they would continue to say stuff, and he never lost the thread, and he remembered everything that was said. So it's not quite either. It's sort of in between the 2 examples you gave, but I'll qualify that by saying that was a fairly high level channeling, and the Ophanim said he had prepared a number of lifetimes for it. So it's tricky. Again, it's epistemology. You have to be able to trust it. And what you call trance channeling, maybe the fidelity is better in a certain sense, but if you can't see in a wakeful state who's talking to you, you'd be a fool to trust them. How can you tell they're not jerking you around? And, Ra, I read those books when they came out in the early 1970s. I'm aware of them. Even to say the agency was Ra is suspect. Ra was the Egyptian name for the solar logos. That's King Arthur. Are they saying they're channeling King Arthur? I mean, that's what Ra was at that level. And frankly, no one's going to channel the solar logos. It's too many notches above human consciousness. You see what I'm saying? So that's an epistemological question right there.
Yeah.
I don't mean to, disparage that source. I'm just saying when I read those books, it raised that question.
Yeah. Well, for myself as well, because it is a, because if you read the books, they talk about how there was a group that worked with the Mayans and, Quetzalcoatl, and then they have, Ra with the Egyptians. And so, but, they claim that they all come from Venus, right? And so that was the idea. So, but if you look at Mayan mythology, they revered Venus as a source of power, right? And same with the Egyptians, and so anyway, so there's correlations there, but it's like obviously they're the same energy. Quetzalcoatl is Ra, and Ra is Quetzalcoatl.
No, Quetzalcoatl is not Ra.
Oh, you don't think? Okay,
different beings.
Well, I meant the same. They come from the same, I guess, if you want to call it level. Yeah, exactly, the same club, right? So it's kind of like it's two names for the same energy, I guess, if that makes sense, at least from my understanding. But what do you think on that?
Let me qualify that a little bit. There was this guy named Charles Ledbetter, who was a pal of Helene Blavatsky, who started Theosophy in the 1880s and did the Isis Unveiled and the Secret Doctrine. He was sort of an early precursor of New Age type looking priest wannabes, but he was actually pretty genuine. His clairvoyance was good. And in one of his books, he talked about the Lords of the Flames coming from Venus to settle the original Shambhala a long time ago, 40,000 years, 400,000 years ago. You have to be careful with numbers because usually it's a lot earlier than people realize. But the attribution to Venus was in place. When you talk about the myths of Quetzalcoatl from the Mexican tradition, the horned serpent, although it's nothing to do with snakes, it's sort of a misleading thing. The attribution was that Quetzalcoatl's homeland was Venus. But here's where you have to be subtle. And let's come back to your having brought up Kabbalah. And you mentioned the term Netzach. That's one of the spheres of light on the tree of life. In case people don't know what this means, it's a 3 pillars with 10 circles in different places on them. And it's a kind of hierarchical cascade of consciousness from the highest to the ground level. That's sort of the meaning of it. It's called Tree of Life. And Netzach, in terms of, if you map the planets, no, let me start this way. If you map the chakras to the Tree of Life, Netzach ends up being where the heart chakra is. Heart chakra is actually correlated with Venus and not the sun. The throat is the sun. And anyway, Netzach, if you take it not literally in terms of the physical planet Venus, but more as a hierarchical level of existence, sort of way beyond the physical, that may have some correlation with the physical planet, but it's not the physical planet altogether. That's a place of origin for a lot of the wholesome aspects of the planet, including Quetzalcoatl, who was a salvific figure in Mexican culture. And it was also, for those who are old enough to remember it, the basis of the myth of the harmonic convergence of August 1987, where the native peoples of that part of southern Mexico said, Quetzalcoatl will return to where he buried his heart, and it will be released and spread out across the world. That was the whole storyline behind the harmonic convergence in 1987.
Is that, would you say that that's analogous to, the Epiphany event, right? So kind of the right Christ energy coming?
It is different.
Yeah.
Do you want me to talk about the...
yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Okay. I'm going to talk about Lucifer and his feminine complement, Sophia. Most people think is an out-of-work goddess at this point, but she's not. Okay. The thing about Lucifer, Lord of Light, that's what his name means, light bearer, is the most successful false flag operation ever conducted regarding the earth was the Antichrist to get everyone to believe that Lucifer is the Antichrist. They're actually two separate beings. Lucifer and his complement Sophia were the first two created archangels. They're created even before the 18 archangels, including Michael, who's considered sort of the big shot of them all. First created with a mission to hold and administer the light across the galaxy and to stand as role models for the development of humanity into a state of free will and higher consciousness and eventually enlightenment. That was their mission. And I'm going to have to keep it sort of simple, but basically what Lucifer and Sophia do is they are the middle point, the median, the balance point between the Christ and the Antichrist. Or if you don't like the term Antichrist, Satan, the Druge, every culture has their name for the chief bad guy. Take your pick. Antichrist is just easier because it means opposed to everything the Christ stands for. Clairvoyance, nature, the feminine, Mrs. God, matter. Antichrist says, no, screw all that. I'm against it. Okay. So Lucifer and Sophia are the midpoint between the Christ and the Antichrist because they are the embodiment of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. They are the embodiment of it. They're not a tree, but the tree's a metaphor. Good, Christ, evil, Antichrist. I know that's too simplistic, but that's the original purpose. And believe it or not, everyone has a complementary copy of that tree in their heart chakra. In fact, they have the other tree too, the tree of life, as described in the Garden of Eden. We have both of them. What's outside is inside. So Lucifer and Sophia were commissioned by the Supreme Being after presenting the old man a proposal that Supreme Being create an embodied, biologically mortal life form capable of dilation to the full extent of the angelic realm, right? Full cosmic consciousness, and establish them on a planet in a case of free will, and a fabulous light grid. And they would act as caretakers, superintendents in a very loose sense. And what happened is the first round of humanity abused all of their psychic powers. It was, if you've ever watched movies like X-Men or any of the comic book heroes with all the magic powers, you can put fire out of your eyes and all. Well, those are actual powers of the chakras. And the first round of humans totally abused them, just about trashed the whole planet. And Supreme Being said, no, we got to call a halt to this. So he drowned them all. That's called the Great Flood, right? Just, they're gone. Lilith and Pandora are names left over from that. Lilith was the disobedient first wife of Adam, which is not a patriarchal picture. Adam was not a guy. Adam was the name of the generic blueprint for human consciousness. It means the Aleph in the blood. It's a Hebrew name, Aleph in the blood, which is the same, saying basically angelic consciousness that could possibly be awakened in the context of a body with blood. Adam, the red-blooded, you have to be careful. You're dealing with a lot of old metaphors there. And Lucifer and Sophia have 3,496 temples around the planet. That's a lot. And originally, they were beautiful installations where you could go there and have epiphanies in the small sense, lowercase e, not the one with the Christ, but smaller epiphanies of these lords of light. Also, one of their functions, and this pertains to the larger epiphany, is that, as Steiner once said, Lucifer bears the light, Christ is the light. That makes Lucifer and Sophia like Grail maidens or like the Grail itself, which holds the Christ light. So the working relationship between them originally was intimate. One holds the light, the other is the light. That's pretty cool. And there's a Mrs. Christ and a Mrs. Lucifer, we have to always remember. Well, it was as if they were parents of teenagers and they had co-signed a loan for the teenagers to buy an expensive car. And the teenagers trashed the car. It was worthless and hadn't been paid off yet. And the parents were stuck with the debt. They had to pay the debt off. They didn't do anything wrong. The teenagers did. That's the first group of humans. And so two things happened. One, the condition of wide open, almost ultimate psychic freedom on the planet had to be turned down a bit. It was like running a fire too hot. And so the way they adjusted the fire was they had to close down almost half of the temples, like adjusting a furnace. And then with the advent of authoritarian religions, the people running those religions locked down some more light temples out of consistency to their doctrinal program that Lucifer was a fallen angel and he was down in the 9th level of hell, like Dante mistakenly presented him, and they're bad and had to be punished, and don't ever mention his name again. So a number of places got locked down for that secondary reason. See, it's a very complicated thing. In fact, getting clear on the Lucifer Sophia reality is the biggest challenge and threshold confronting humanity. If you want to save the planet, you got to get your head straight on the true story. Everything depends on it. I know it sounds a little dogmatic to put it that way, but it's a fact. And the sad thing is, it's a fact that's so completely suppressed in half the planet. Half the planet thinks he's a bad guy. The other planet, half of the planet doesn't care. They've got their own myths, or they have no myths. Like secular countries in Scandinavia, they're sensible because they don't abide by any religion to any great degree, not like America and France and other places. So it's a very big picture. However, there's one payoff to getting clear on the Lucifer and Sophia truth, and that is, if you've ever watched the TV show called Stargate SG-1 that ran for 10 years, it showed these Air Force guys going through a physical wormhole device that would translate them to another planet in 2 seconds. That is actually a reality. It's not quite as technologically palpable as that, but the principle is the same. There's actually 2 million Stargates on the planet that go to 300 planets, which means 300 worlds that are physically and psychologically congruent with humanity that we could visit. This system is currently not operational because Lucifer and Sophia, too many copies of them are in the slammer. Like 3,496 sites, if half of them are closed down, that means, let's say 1,500 copies of Lucifer and Sophia are unavailable for consciousness. They're the ones that run the Stargate network. Can you follow the implications of that?
Yeah.
I mean, the Stargate network, aside from the fact that it would put NASA and the airline industry sort of out of business and expand the notion of tourism,
yeah,
it cannot operate until this sort of fundamental theological issue is resolved. And it's in the interest of those people who are still mad at the Supreme Being to keep it unresolved, because it would mean humans would have power, freedom, cognitive scope. That's a threat. It's sort of like the same threat that a lot of people consider Trump to embody. He's like radical change. Well, from the point of view of the disgruntled aliens, a Stargate network in a liberated Lucifer and Sophia is a similar kind of, well, it's probably a bigger threat. But you can sort of get to that idea and through the example I just gave. I know it's a big picture, but
no, it's fascinating. It kind of, if you're familiar with, UFO circles, like people who are very interested in ET and stuff like that, they talk about how abduction phenomenon tends to happen more to people who have either the propensity for psychic abilities or kind of or have active psychic abilities. And so there appears to be a large interest by these intelligent beings to examine those who do exhibit psychic abilities, or to prevent the full expression of those psychic abilities. So it is an interesting correlation to what you were just talking about. It almost like there is some fear or some concern that if humans develop psychic abilities without the advanced ethical and consciousness that comes along with that there could be dire consequences. So it's very interesting. And it also is interesting that Lucifer relates to Venus, right, as a morning star, which we were talking about Ra and whatnot is related to Venus. So I thought that was,
as long as we don't mean it in terms of the physical planet.
Right. Well, yeah. So the name morning star.
Unfortunate, because it's the same problem that the earth is called the earth. It really would be better if it weren't, because you have this axiom that in the beginning God created heaven and earth, and people think he created the heavenly world and then planet earth. That isn't what they meant. In fact, the Greeks didn't mean that either when they said Gaia. They didn't mean a female in the planet. They meant cosmic earth, the entire galaxy as a container for matter. That's what they meant by earth. And so it's the same with calling our satellite the moon, because everybody thinks, oh, let's pray to the moon. It's a female deity. It's not. It's a dead satellite. The moon they're referring to is a much higher cosmic level of the moon. It's called the origin of silver light, and it's Mrs. God's realm. That's the actual meaning of the moon. Same with the sun. No offense to our local sun, but that's not really what they meant in the myths. They meant the much higher level of it. And so the same thing with Venus is we have to be subtle in interpreting that. It has something to do with the planet, but not in a literal physical sense. And that's part of the delicacy of interpretation that you come up against or is required of you in clairvoyance, especially clairvoyant interpretation of myths. Their myths are true and they did happen, but not in the physical world. And the rules of the world where they did happen are a little slippery. They're tricky. They're changeable. It's a little bit like reading Kafka's The Trial. You're arrested and charged, but they don't tell you what for or when you should show up for your trial. It's sort of a level of ambiguity.
Interesting. So going on the concept of myth in geomythic sites, in our email exchange, you mentioned Vermont and kind of working with geomythic sites there. Do you want to talk about that story?
You had asked, essentially, do you have any evidence that could show cause and effect, geomantic, fixing actual physical world results? Well, one of the first examples I ever saw of that was in 1987. I was still a hobbit, so to speak. I just met Gandalf, you might say. I didn't know anything, although I knew a few things. And I was invited to give a talk at the Dowsers Convention in Vermont. I don't know if that's still going on, but at the time, it was a wild and highly entertaining free-for-all of everybody who's got opinions about anything metaphysical. It's quite fun. And they invited me to give a talk, and I gave a talk and a field trip. And this was located in northern Vermont, rural. Most people think Vermont is where rich people from Connecticut go, but a lot of the rest of Vermont is low income and always has been. So this was in northern Vermont, and we were near a town called Hardwick, which is an English name. Of course, New England was settled by England. And you could take that word literally. The wick is hard to light at Hardwick. In other words, it's hard to get the light into it. I don't know if they named it because they perceived that quality or it developed over time and matched the name. Anyway, we did a field trip with the local knowledge that the town of Hardwick was really hard up. It had low income, crime, low education levels, bad health, sort of the whole package of a low income, neglected area. The physical environment looked a little beat up. It just didn't look like it was a place where life would flourish. So we went to the nearest mountain, because usually mountains or large hills have a geomantic correlate. That's complicated as to why. I could explain that later, perhaps. And we had a bunch of gnomes that would show us where to go, because I've been buddies with the gnomes for a long time. If you want to know where to go within a square mile, ask a gnome. They know the landscape meticulously. So we climbed a small hill or modest-sized mountain, sat down and did a meditation. And I gave the group some simple protocols for aligning with the Angelic Order of the Ophanim. I did a little more complicated stuff. And what happened was, somehow or other, I saw what looked like a giant quartz crystal cluster. I mean, the size of a football stadium, right? Being lowered into the mountain, lowered on and then into the mountain. Remember, it wasn't, we're talking about two different realms, the physical mountain and the light crystal. So you could move a light crystal right through a mountain regardless of the material composition of the mountain. You have to get used to that paradox. And it was sort of like, to use an analogy, changing a spark plug or putting a new motor in the car or something fundamental that would reboot the geomantic structure that the mountain was the place marker for. It had nothing to do with the dirt and rock and plants and whatever trees of the mountain. It had to do with the light temple that was there even before there ever was a mountain, right? And the thing is, you can't look for results the next day. It's a bit like acupuncture. Often the results go sideways. If you have a liver problem, the acupuncturist may not treat your liver meridian, they may treat somewhere else. And eventually the effects work in. Well, I had stayed at a bed and breakfast with a woman, and we talked a little bit about geomancy and stuff. 30 years later, she emailed me and told me about the remarkable changes in the town of Hardwick. The education level gone up, the health level gone up, people had opened bookstores and health food restaurants. The whole place had turned around. Yeah, it may have taken only 10 years, but she didn't tell me until after 30, so I don't know how long it took. But changing, rebooting that geomantic feature which overlooked the town changed everything. Because in a sense, all the physical aspects of reality in that town were under the influence of that geomantic factor. See, but you have to be patient. It's not going to happen necessarily tomorrow. And you sort of have to be, like the Buddhists say, non-attached to results. But that was a vivid example. I wish she had maybe told me earlier instead of 30 years, but less people. But the town had completely turned around.
That's fascinating. And that's really interesting. And, kind of relates to, and I know in our email, you mentioned that, it may have been, it's not necessarily correlated, and I understand that, but I can't help but think about your story about working in Fort Knox with the unbinding, that Lucifer binding site, because the timing of that is very interesting to me, because that happened in 2006, right? Or what year was that?
It wasn't just what you're referring to. Is there is a series. I was working with one of the Ray Masters at the time at a number of what we call Lucifer binding sites to liberate Lucifer and Sophia. And the theme for a number of them was that they were located at the same place where there were large gold deposits. It wasn't just Fort Knox. There were others in other countries. So it wasn't just the Fort Knox. And I know where you're going with this, that after that happened, Bitcoin arose and all this other stuff. I can't attribute a cause and effect to that directly, but I would say if Lucifer and Sophia are bound at a place where a huge amount of money is stored in the form of gold, which used to be and should be again the standard that actually backs the reality of money, which otherwise is just a floating astral concept. And Bitcoin is even more vague than that, even though people are making loads of money from it. Let's say it liberated culture to reconsider the notion of money and value and exchange and what it might be and what alternatives might be for it. I don't think that was the intention. The intention was to get more of the Lucifer sites liberated, but of course there will be correlates. For example, this is not to do with money, but there's a Lucifer binding site where the UN is. And a couple of years ago, we liberated that one. It was kind of funny or weird because there's a UN, giant building next to the East River, a certain amount of acreage, and there's also a giant Lucifer and Sophia temple, which is much, much bigger than that, but the two are in the same place. Now, if you like a paranoid conspiracy theory of reality, which I think is usually justified, certainly in our times, the binding of the two principal lords of light at the same place where you have an outer expression of the world government or world seeker government, or however you picture that, there's an interesting negative congruence there. So you liberate one. Well, it's not like we liberated the UN, but let's say I've noticed in the last 3 or 4 years a more critical view from more people of some of the existing structures, UN, World Economic Forum, the World Health, not necessarily completely taken at face value anymore. A lot of people are raising questions about some of those agencies. So liberating Lucifer and Sophia at a place of sort of world government had that cultural liberating effect. I mean, it was not meant to undermine the UN. It was more like just to wake people up. People are still free to make the choices. I like the secret government. I don't like a secret government. I want to be controlled. I don't want to be controlled. I'll be obedient. I won't be obedient. It's still a free will choice. So
would you say that these, so using a different language maybe for this is that you're talking about interacting with the super consciousness of the species of humanity?
It's the same as saying the light grid.
Right. Okay. So the light grid, and then and these Lucifer binding sites, when you're unbinding them, it's almost like you're unblocking something in that grid, which allows more light to come in. Is that a very simple analogy? But okay, that's the idea.
Now consider this: 3,496 Lucifer sites. That in itself, the distribution pattern of those places is a grid itself. The more sites that are liberated, the more light flows through that grid. It envelops the planet. Also, the original name, well, one of the original names for these sites was Jerusalem. I don't mean the city in Israel. I mean it more like the way William Blake used some of those terms in his really mythic poems like Jerusalem, the emanation of the giant Albion. Also, I worked out the etymology of Jerusalem via its correlation in the word with Shalem and another name for the morning and evening stars right in there in terms of the earlier Ugaritic origin of the word. Basically, Jerusalem means the foundation of Lucifer. I know all the rabbis on the planet would like to do something to me worse than they did to Philip Roth when he did Portnoy's complaint. But let's just say the term is suggestive. And so I use it as a way of referring to the original light temples of Lucifer and Sophia in their free state. When things got turned down in terms of the furnace and in terms of punishment and reprisals, they became binding sites. The light temple got converted to a jail. And so to unbind them, you have to stage a jailbreak, although it's coordinated with the angelic realm. The Supreme Being gives the go-ahead. It's all very orderly and official. And you can only do a few at a time, because what happens is it's a very potent energy. Lucifer and Sophia are the prime examples of human consciousness in a state of total cognitive freedom and scope. That would scare the pants off most people, because it's too much of a dilation of awareness. So it has to be a little at a time. We did 24 places a couple years ago, and probably won't do any more for a few years because that energy has to be assimilated into both the light grid and human consciousness, even if it's at a subconscious level. It's very powerful. It's just that it's powerful in a subtle sense. It's almost like saying two things. The rug got pulled out from under you and you didn't see who did it. And second, you just got slammed in the face and you don't know what hit you. I don't mean this any kind of physical injury, but I'm just using analogies to suggest that everything has to be done in increments. You don't want people to go crazy when you're trying to liberate the planet. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so, right. And doing it slowly kind of introduces changes, you know, in a more subtle way. And so, yeah, I find that really fascinating because, like, you know, it sounds like doing this work, you know, opens up the possibility for new ideas to come into the planet, for new opportunities, for new, you know, ways of being, things like this. And so, you know, for example, when you were working with gold, right, trying to change the structure of gold, it seems like, you know, from that point forward, you know, we have, and again, you know, just kind of using it as an illustration, but like you do have the idea of like the housing collapse and Bitcoin and cryptocurrency coming in. And, you know, to me, it seems like, you know, you could make a connection there where like ideas coming in and people are more receptive to these things as a result of that, where they probably wouldn't have been before.
Sometimes there is what you would call collateral damage. Let's use the image of a house of cards or a Lego set where a kid has built a structure, but the foundations are not secure, or some of the side pieces are jerry-rigged. If you pull a piece out, the whole thing may collapse, or you may have unexpected results that are in addition to the intended result. In other words, I can't say for certain that Supreme Being, the Angelic Order and the Great White Brotherhood wanted to change the vibration of gold and money on the planet. They may have, they may not have, but there was certainly some sideways results, like you referred to, introduction of Bitcoin and the financial collapse, et cetera. That may not have been the original intent, though.
Right.
Again,
right.
House of Cards. You know what I'm saying? Like,
yeah.
Some part of the structure is faulty, and you pull on it, and then it's going to be revealed that it's not stable.
That's interesting. And I suppose a lot of the time it's in your working is you don't necessarily know the higher purpose for it, right? It's not necessarily given to you as like, do this because of X, right?
Oh, it's even worse than that. The higher multiple purposes. Let's say there's a layer, like a palimpsest of 6 purposes. First we get this one done, then that opens up the next one. And we're not necessarily read into the program. It's more like the whole funding would say, would you mind showing up at this place, bring some people, do this, that, and the other thing? And it probably has something to do with the following. And you realize you're only telling you 10%. Not because they're coy, not because it's classified, but probably because I wouldn't understand. And not because I'm stupid or didn't graduate college or something like that. It's more like the unavoidable hyperdimensionality of something that's just beyond our current mental ability to understand. You know what I'm saying? So you can't tell us because it just wouldn't translate into English. Or
would you say one of the other reasons might be because if they tell you it has to deal with time and the essence of like, oh, well, you know, now there may be introducing a variable in the timeline which could screw things up. If that makes sense. It might be a little too sci-fi, but just thinking along the lines of that, perhaps.
Well, I don't think we have enough geomantic scope to really screw things up like that. The timeline of the Earth is as a very good security detail guarding it. You can't really get to that. You can in science fiction shows, but in reality, you can't. It's very well guarded. There's a whole council called the Time Lords. You ever watch Doctor Who? It's actually for real. There are Time Lords. 104, they're based on the island of Gozo next to Malta. Not physically, but that's where they are. They manage the Earth timeline. And there's actually a ferocious beast that guards it as well. It's the Egyptians called it Apophis and said it was a nasty pain in the butt aquatic thing that swam alongside Ra's boat of millions of years. And Steiner called it Soroth, the sun demon. Both of those are wrong. It's more like a gargoyle the size of King Kong, appointed to guard the timeline. Of course, he has to look ferocious to scare away people who might be tempted to mess with it. So, anyway, that's a little
interesting
footnote on the timeline.
Yeah. I wonder if there's any, and this is completely random, but I know there's a lot of myth about Malta, the giants of Malta, and the megalithic structures there. I wonder if
this is the island next to Malta.
Oh, okay. But near. Okay, never mind.
Right next, but technically it's a separate piece of land.
Gotcha. Yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff that's supposed to have happened and still is happening on Malta, which is interesting. I don't know if you have any information on that or if you can comment on it.
No, not on Malta per se. I mean, Gozo is the place that I've identified as the headquarters of that. But let's say there are a lot of what we would call anomalous landscape sites around the planet in which the original geomancy, is the installation of light temples in a certain plan and pattern, think of it like a mandala, still have some potency to them and still emanate little clues and whispers as to their purpose and activity. And human consciousness as a global phenomenon has somewhat dulled its own receptor ability to hear those, but in a few places they're loud enough that it sort of breaks through. But I wouldn't say Malta is unique in that respect. You could probably make a long list of sites that have intriguing, anomalous aspects to it that are sort of like, well, if you go back to one of the Greek myths of the sirens, the females who stand on the shore of a lake or something and call out alluringly to guys on the boat, and the guys, being usual males, jump in the boat to go get to the girls. Of course, that's not the meaning of the story. The sirens are actually Nephilim and Angelic Order who looks after humanity and actually loves them, and they're not trying to entice them to do anything. But the myths suggest that there is this kind of ancient or numinous call from these mysterious figures, the sirens, that is almost irresistible by humans. Well, that would be the same as saying Malta has got some cool and weird stuff still going on there. It's just a different way of putting it.
Fascinating. Let's maybe shift into some of the techniques that you implement. I know in your books you highlight the significance of the blue dish when you're in your work. Can you kind of talk about that a bit?
The blue dish is a term, I don't know, I think I may have come up with it, or maybe the Ophanim came up with it. It is like when you put a dish under a potted plant, so that you can either fill the dish with water and the roots absorb it, or if you put too much water in the potted plant, it'll spill into the blue dish and not onto your table. All right, so a blue dish, geomantically speaking, is similar to that. It's created by a combination of consciousness of a human or multiple humans and the Ophanim to create a kind of blended condition, which you then can shape into what initially looks like a pale blue tea saucer. If you're British or if you've ever been to a tea shop, you got a teacup and it goes on a saucer, slightly concave, right? Just picture it as sky blue, and your consciousness is actually comprising that blue dish with the Ophanim, and then you can expand it to whatever size is required, and you lay it under the given geomantic site, whether it's an individual mountain, an entire community like Glastonbury or Sedona, or place in London where St. Paul's Cathedral is, Ludgate Hill, any size. You can even, the biggest one we ever did was a few years ago for the Epiphany. It was 17,000 miles across. It was pretty wild. But usually they're much more modest, 500 yards, 1,000 yards, a mile. It depends on whether there's houses nearby. You don't want to intrude it into someone's house. It's bad manners. But if you're out in the country or a place like Stonehenge or Avebury, you can extend it a fair bit. And the reason is it helps anchor celestial light to then rise up into the feature. If you were to tune into the blue dish, which is made of light, you would actually be able to see representations of an innumerable amount of stars and the star gods associated with them. Star gods is a way of saying the ensouling intelligence of a star. It's sort of like the animistic model applied to the galaxy, like tree spirits, whatever. And this feeds upwards into the site as a kind of nutrient, just like how a plant needs water. So a geomantic node, a light temple, needs some celestial input, which to it is like water or like a nutrient, right? Vitamin C, vitamin B, nutrients like that. Originally, the entire planet was floriated with blue dishes. I call it the morning glory planet. You ever seen blue morning glories? A gorgeous flower. They only last a morning. It's yellow center, sky blue exterior, a suggestion of either a pentagon or a hexagon shape. Gorgeous flowers. It's my favorite. Well, the whole planet had millions of blue dishes under all the sites originally. They were put there by the geomantic engineers who set the place up. They don't last forever. They're, depending on your confidence and ability when you create them, they can last for a while, years, centuries. Although in recent years, well, nobody's been doing them that I'm aware of, except for a few people that I've shown how to do it. So the planet is very much deficient in these. Now, here's a fun example. I gave a talk to some other dowsers in New Hampshire around that same time, and the place where the conference was had some geomantic aspects to it, and I installed a blue dish sort of for demonstration purposes. It was about 300 yards in radius, and I had the people who could dowse see if they could dowse where the edge of the blue dish was. They all found it. It said it's right here, within 5 feet or so. So it is kind of a detectable shape. But the main point is that all the geomantic nodes on the planet desperately need the blue dishes under them, and hardly any of them have them. I mean, I put in loads and loads with my small group, but there's millions to go. It's sort of like something is supposed to be part of the light grid pattern, and because people haven't known about it, basically once the indigenous population sort of dwindled in numbers, the white people really didn't pick up the slack, especially in America. So it just hasn't been done, and everything's really behind the curve on that point.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you talk about it's a dish, right? As a parabolic shape. Yeah. So then
shallow.
Yeah, right, shallow. Okay, yeah. So and you talk about how so it almost seems like from a physical analogy, satellite dish or like a radio, something that can receive.
That's a little too
parabolic. Okay. Yeah.
Sea saucer is really the best example.
Sea saucer. Okay, interesting.
Almost flat.
Yeah. Are you familiar with the round towers of Ireland by chance?
I don't think so.
Yeah. So okay. Yeah. Sure. So there's these round towers that were built in like 500 AD, and they're all over Ireland. And a author researcher called Philip Callahan discovered that so what's interesting about these towers is that the grass grows it's around the tower. It's very fertile. And in fact, in some of the sites, farmers bring their cows specifically there because the grass is much more healthy. And a researcher named Philip Callahan mapped out all the towers in Ireland and discovered that they actually align with the winter solstice, which is very interesting. And so, and he discovered that they're paramagnetic, and there's actually, a field being, there's energy being drawn from these towers and brought into the earth essentially. And so the prevailing theory is that they were built specifically for this purpose, right? To kind of,
I get it.
Yeah. So very interesting.
Let's say that's a sort of more contemporary version of standing stones. Standing stones originally were installed by the Elohim. They're imprinted with a vibration that would last for a long time. The physical stone would actually convey that vibration. It would affect the landscape around it and people who went near it. And sometimes they even had impressions of dancing maidens who danced on the Sabbath and got punished and all that Christian stuff. Well, the towers, let's say, okay, they're not the same as a standing stone, but it is stone, and stone conducts the vibration and of light and can carry it for a long time. And let's say the people who put them in place were sufficiently aware of the microstructure of their landscape in terms of ley lines, which is an umbrella term that is sometimes oversimplified, but it refers to lines of light and energy going across the landscape in various patterns. And they planted them purposely on the ley lines or intersections of ley lines. And then possibly if there was a person with sufficient ability, they could then sort of empower or initialize the towers with an additional thought form, or even better, if they had actual contact with the Great White Brotherhood or Angelic Orders, they could, shall I say, download a little bit of a blessing on the towers that would last for a while. And the intent would be, yes, it would improve all the aspects of nature, consciousness, animals would be happy, cows would be frolicking. I'm exaggerating. So sure, I get it. That's quite plausible. Ireland, by the way, I wrote a book about Ireland a couple years ago, focusing on their picture of Lucifer and Sophia. But I gained a strong impression that the myths of Ireland are probably even older than India, because they go back to the picture of Lucifer, as I figured out in Irish myth, is totally without blemish, is totally before even the Greek model of Prometheus, where he defied God and got punished and strapped down to a mountain. That's still fairly recent. The Irish myths and the Irish landscape is probably one of the oldest on the planet. People don't usually think of it. I think India or Australia or someplace. But the nature of the myths and how the activities and heroes of the myths are presented is just unlike what you find in any other myths. Plus, the landscape is a innately protected sanctuary. It's an island. Iceland, Ireland, Australia, they're ideal geomantic workshops. Because if you look at Europe, the boundaries of a lot of those countries has changed like crazy all over the time. Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, the boundaries are almost arbitrary. They're not the way they're originally drawn to match the ethnos of the people living there. The French, Irish, Italians, those are ethnos groupings that were assigned to landscapes. Ireland is a perfect example to study things like that. So that man you quoted, he's on to some valuable stuff with that.
Fascinating, man. Well, I guess going into landscape egregores, right? We did touch on that in our last conversation, and we're touching on it now. But you mentioned in our email correspondence I was talking about petroglyphs and about how, it would be fascinating to kind of, examine them and to try to discover the rituals that these native peoples used in order to access the geomantic features there. And you mentioned the Aboriginals, and do you want to kind of talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a good topic. Let's say it is not a definite situation that the petroglyphs are meaningful in present day. I mean, you could even make the argument that some of them were like teenage graffiti from earlier cultures. But that might sound a little too cynical. But I would say the way to approach it is take the existing petroglyphs, or like in Ireland, there's a lot of circles, and Aboriginals have, actually their glyphs are more like maps of their own landscape. So they're sort of, you have to put them aside because they're actually a superior example of it. But the real issue is, let's take the petroglyphs as like a billboard advertising something. I was saying there is something here of note, right? So the way I would investigate it is to use clairvoyance to see what is there. Is there, in fact, an energy feature that the petroglyph is a road marker for? Or in some way, maybe a code or a key, but not necessarily. Maybe just like a billboard. What's there? Is it dormant? Is it toxic? Is it workable? Is it meant to be turned on again? And what is the actual feature, and how does it work? And, is it recommended that the place be reopened for public visitation? Then you can check back to see if the petroglyph had any kind of discernible relevance to what you saw. It might, or it might not. I'm not going to worry too much about petroglyphs other than take them as billboards. I don't mean to insult any ancient cultures. Maybe that's why they put them there in the first place. Or if they put them there for a purposeful kind of map of the landscape, with all due respect, so what? Clairvoyants can come up with better maps, because that might have been 10,000 years ago. Consciousness has moved on. Steiner talked about that all the time. And current clairvoyant investigation protocols might be superior to what indigenous people had a long time ago. No offense to anybody, but that's just how things are. Things improve, just like smartphones and computers. We're not insulting Steve Jobs to say his first Apples were pretty primitive compared to now. That's how it started. But, the current ones, like my iMac, it's a whole lot better than my first Mac, right? So that's the way I would approach it. The petroglyph may or may not be relevant, and you can only tell if you investigated what is actually there. It might be a map for interaction, but it might be an antiquated map, because the protocols for geomantic interaction keep evolving. Even, I'll give you an example. I wrote a book on Rudolf Steiner, so I had to read a 6 feet tall pile of books on Steiner to sort of see what his head was about. And he created 2 massive physical temples called the Goetheanum, named after Goethe, his sort of mentor across the centuries. The first one, the Nazis burned down. The second one, they couldn't because it was made of stone. The first was wood. And Steiner wrote about his, quote, ritual or procedure for dedicating the building. And as I recall, dug a hole and sort of followed the myth of the foundation stone and planted a kind of physical representation of a dodecahedron. That's like a basketball with 12 pentagons on it, dodecahedron, 12 faces. And he buried that at one corner of the building, or where the corner would be, said some stuff, whatever, some language. And then they built a building. I asked the Ophanim later, because we were contemplating acquiring a place or setting up a center in England. I said, do we have to go through all that stuff? He said, no, no offense to Steiner, but protocols for initiating buildings have moved on. And what we have taught you, no offense to Steiner, is more sophisticated and streamlined and quicker and simpler and more effective. So this is not disparaging Steiner. It's just that 100 years later, the spiritual world had new techniques that they could introduce because overall consciousness had advanced. I mean, I'm part of the baby boom generation, which now is a bunch of old people from the point of view of young people. But there was a pretty favorable astrological configuration that a whole generation was born under. And a lot of innovations came out of that, and including a dilation of consciousness. People took up changes in diet and agriculture and meditation and consciousness and all kinds of stuff in the last 50 years since I was in college, right? That's what I mean. So we didn't have to do all the stuff that Steiner did. The Ophanim had a simpler, more effective approach. See?
Yeah, no, that's makes a whole lot of sense.
We don't necessarily want to copy old ways.
Yeah.
It may not actually be the best ways to use. No offense to the cultures, but just for the examples I've given, there are more modern protocols that work better. It's
very interesting, to talk about the concept of these protocols moving on and evolving. And it's we like to think that things stay the same and people get conservative with their beliefs and their techniques, and they get very dogmatic, right? And so I love the idea that, even the Ophanim and the higher angelic realms they're constantly evolving. Things are changing. The protocols are being different. And so that's really interesting. So, when you're looking at petroglyphs, it's like, I like your analogy of like they're billboards. They're just signposts. They're old. It's fun to study, but it's not necessarily going to give you anything that different than if you were just going to work directly with the Ophanim.
It's not going to get you through the front door.
Right. And so accessing that landscape, let's say, I mentioned a place in Arizona. And so, Arizona, Phoenix area has tons of petroglyphs. The Hohokam culture there, their mountains are very sacred to them. And it's obvious when you go any of the hiking trails around the area, you'll find tons of petroglyphs. So they obviously, outside of any kind of graffiti or something, and some markings are very obviously astronomy related, and so outside of that, they obviously consider certain areas very sacred. But it's just interesting to kind of look at, them as possible guideposts, as possible markings, as to okay, and like you said, you can see, okay, they mark this place. Let's clairvoyantly examine it and see what they.
I know where you're going with that. Yeah. Let me give you an example, very recent. I said that this year's Epiphany from January 3rd to the 9th was set in Australia, Mount Warning. The native name is Wollumban. It means old chief fellow. It's an Aboriginal sacred site. The Ophanim wanted us to correlate that with 3 other sites that were actually 2,000 miles away. Uluru, the big red rock, everyone's heard of that. The Olgas, it's a bunch of weird rocks sticking out of the landscape that look like heads. And then the McDonald range of mountains. They wanted all 4 of those coordinated together. Now, we had a slight political problem initially because my group, we're all trained clairvoyants. We're fairly, we don't have PhDs, but we're educated in the things that matter in terms of myth and protocols. We didn't want to insult the Aboriginals, not to mention their myth and symbol system is even harder to understand than Native American. For someone who didn't grow up with animals and birds and all the rest of it, it's like, it just takes a while to get what they mean. And a lot of the Aboriginal things I don't get still. So we didn't want to insult any of the Aboriginals, both physical and in spirit form. Yet there was a mandate from the Supreme Being passed on through the angelic realm that the Epiphany would go on through there. We would participate in doing the setup. Think of it like another Woodstock. We were setting up the stage and the sound and the chairs. Then the band comes on. That's the Christ light. If you don't mind the flip comparison. And we didn't want to insult anyone, but we had our own protocols. And I also knew, even though I found the Aboriginal myths and landscapes and symbol system fascinating, I studied them in college, sort of on the side, you might say. They did somewhat correspond to what Steiner called atavistic Lemurian consciousness. In other words, Steiner talked about an early phase of human consciousness where the psychics would sort of swim with the gods in the midst of the gods' images of reality, but they did not do it from a point of individuated autonomy of consciousness. They sort of lost themselves in the dream of the gods. So Steiner called that atavistic Lemurian consciousness. Lemurian meaning the time period of the continent of Lemuria. Atavistic, he didn't mean to insult anyone. It just means it's no longer appropriate. Consciousness has moved on. It's more anchored. We met a few of the Aboriginal elders in vision. Said, look, we don't want to insult you guys, but we have our protocols and we have to do this work. I hope you guys are all right with it. We don't want to trash anything or step on your myths, but et cetera. And so the Ophanim worked out a diplomatic thing. I mean, maybe it wasn't even a problem other than mental. And so we were able to interact with the Aboriginal sites. We could make sense of some of the myths that they attributed to them. We sort of translated them to things that we understood. And I think we got some of them right. But there was a case of having a very antique culture. The Aboriginals say they've been there forever, just about, coming up against modern protocols and current geomantic necessities so that nobody got insulted, but the work could be done. And it turned out to be pretty good. I still don't totally understand their symbol system, but it didn't matter. And their landscape got the benefit of this vast infusion because, Aboriginals, how should I say, their status in Australia was far worse than the status of blacks in America in the 1800s. You know what I mean? It's just worse. Although the epiphany wasn't about the Aboriginals, they were the original inhabitants. They were the caretakers of the land, just like Native Americans were of America. So the whole thing was a big validation for their landscape. Yes, it's sacred. We know it's sacred. We know why it's sacred. Geomantically empowered. There's like 40 different light temples involved between those 4 sites. That's pretty rich. Take 4 versions of New York City and put them all next to each other. That's sort of like that. So anyway, I think that's where you're heading with what you were saying. I thought I'd bring that up as a current example.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, I was, so just kind of interacting with it. That's very interesting. So you struggled understanding and translating some of their symbols, but it kind of made me think of this concept of, and again, it's a little sci-fi, but like I love thinking sometimes of the idea of like, how would we communicate with another star system, right? How could we translate? Would they understand our stories, our myths, our kinds of, obviously outside of the cultural aspects, the fundamental aspect of our myths, would they be able to understand them because we come from the same, galaxy, for instance, and it just really is interesting. As a thought experiment, it's like, how would you translate these? Would they be able to translate? Different star systems have different archetypes, myths, right? They
That's
kind
where Joseph Campbell was heading, and even Mircea Eliade in their discipline of comparative mythology. Both of those guys, Campbell's much more well-known than Eliade, but they both did the same kind of work, studying multiple cultures for their myth systems and finding correlates among them and equivalences. Like, I don't know if Campbell went into this specifically, but looking for what did one culture, Europeans called a certain kind of temple a Grail castle. What did the Polynesians call it? And you find out an equivalent name, and you're actually starting to do some of that translation work. Well, you could take that same principle and apply it higher. There are certain fundamental archetypes used in design, not necessarily for the physiognomic appearance of a life form. Those are not all going to look like people. But here's an example. Let's take Canis Major. It's a constellation of the Greater Dog. It has Sirius, the famous star everybody talks about. It's in the throat of the dog, more or less. And you think, and there's about 13 or so, 14 named stars, and then a bunch that have numbers, right? So there's a lot of them that are cataloged. You think, what does this bunch of stars have to do with dogs? It doesn't look like a dog, not really. So then you have to say, well, what is a dog? A dog is loyal, a great companion of humans, protects the house or protects the property of the master, whoever is responsible for the dog, is faithful, is fun to be with usually, will protect you, will play with you, go for walks, etc. So the constellation must be dog-like. Then if you look at the Hindu myths of the star Sirius, they attribute that to Shiva, who is the god of destruction. But that means destruction of ignorance, not burning down buildings and cities. And they call the Sirius or Shiva star the guardian of the house of the stars. So you put the image of a dog to the constellation and you start making sense of it. This constellation of the dog and Sirius in particular is your go-to psychopomp or conductor of souls through the myriad of stars that constitute the galaxy. Now, what if you lived in the Pleiades and they don't have dogs? You know what I mean? You'd have to come up with a different way of describing. This constellation is like something different. But if you understand the function and what the mythic metaphor referred to, the constellation is dog-like, faithful, loyal, protecting, will bark if needed, is companion, and it's a different animal or a different feature, you can eventually work out the equivalence and understand what they mean. That's just comparative mythology at a psychic level. I mean, I wish, it's too bad Eliade and Campbell were around because those guys are like inches away from being clairvoyant. They would have gotten fired if they officially were clairvoyant, but the next step past Joseph Campbell and Mircea Eliade is clairvoyant investigation of comparative mythology. Then it really gets fun. You really start to open some doors.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I love their work, particularly Eliade. I've read a few of his books, but on shamanism in particular, it's fascinating. His insights into that. So the light grid itself, and I want to go back to kind of our email and some of the questions we raised there. You mentioned something very interesting, that the light grid and sacred sites are made of consciousness stacked in a hierarchy of steps like a Mayan pyramid. Can you elaborate a bit on that concept?
Yeah. Well, let's say what I call the light grid, which is a complicated, multiple layered geometry of lines of light and structures of light and processes of light. It's very complex. It's got loads of layers. It's even more complicated than human body if you're a surgeon. The intent was twofold. One, to make the ecosphere possible. That's what actually supports all the life forces of nature. The Greeks called it physis, the combination of etheric and physical forces supporting the body of the human and the body of nature and the body of the planet. That's one function. The second function is to act as a do-it-yourself cosmogonic revelation of where you came from and why and how. Do-it-yourself. In other words, you interact with the sites. All the clues are there. You have to put a certain number together, just like climbing steps of a Mayan pyramid. Just 50 or 100 till you get to the top. Each revelation provides that. There's an old word for that. It's called hierophantic, the revealing of the holy light. Hierophantic. It's a great word. I think Eliade used that a lot. Somebody used it a lot. I just copied it from that. I figured if they can use it, I can use it. Revealing of the holy light. The light grid reveals the holy light, which means the structures of consciousness intended for humans, the edited version of God's idea for creation adjusted to the human design. And it's meant to be interactive, and it's meant to reveal in stages who you really are, not who you are in your Facebook persona page, but who you are as a cosmic being, who you are when you die and you decide to reincarnate. Who is doing that deciding? That level, right? That's the only level that counts. And so multiple features, 613 different kinds of light temples, each designed to produce a revelation. And more than that, the revelation becomes an empowerment. It's not like you go to a Disneyland and say, oh, look at cool rides. There's Mickey Mouse and there's Pluto and all the cartoon figures. You become Mickey Mouse, you become Pluto, you become whatever the characters are. In this case, you become, how should I say? No, it's more like you assimilate the process of consciousness the light temple is delivering. so that you and the light temple and the deity behind it are the same. It's the same principle as the Tibetans use to explain mandala meditation. Mandalas are complicated design. They've got sort of gateways and deities, and at the center, it's a bit like a labyrinth, but it's not a minotaur. It's more like God at the center. And the understanding is that you use this as a meditative visualization and sort of walk it in your consciousness. And when you get to each threshold or each deity, you become one with it. You identify with it, understand its energies, and then keep on moving. The light grid's the same idea, but the intent is to provide the answer to anyone who asks, who am I? What is this place? How did I get here? What am I supposed to do? And when do I get to leave? Sooner or later, everyone's going to ask this question. Right now, in terms of culture, especially America, maybe not that many people are asking the question. There's an enormous amount of distractions, but sooner or later, in, maybe 100 lifetimes from now, a certain person will ask the question, or they'll ask it this life. The light grid is there as a do-it-yourself answer. And it's not just that it's not like taking a course in college. Okay, now I know about geology. It's more like you are the rocks, or you are the principles of tectonic upheaval or volcanism and how the landscape got created. You are actually those energies, which is part of the cosmic design of the human. You are more empowered. And I hate to use the word, but in a sense, you're more enlightened. You're more read into the program, to use the spy language, right? And if that's something that interests a person, the light grid is where you go do it. It was designed for that. And the myths are like a playbook. They're like psychic images and shorthand that show you the features and the protocols for the interaction. The once and future light temples, the same 10,000 years ago in Greece, or right now, the myths are still relevant because they are psychic pictures. Show you how to interact and who are the big shots at the place, who's running this temple.
Right, and they're always in flux, right? So the protocols change.
Well, the protocols change, but the myths stay the same.
Right. And that's what's interesting is the idea that, the myths, again, going back to Iliad, Campbell, talking about the myths of the Aboriginals are difficult to understand, but it's you could have a framework for that and understand, the fundamental related myth that you can access and you can get behind in order to assist.
Here's an example. And I don't mean this in any boasting sense, but if we were an oral culture and not a written one, a lot of the exploits that I write about in my books involving the Ophanim, the Elohim, the Seraphim, and whatnot, and the wild and crazy stuff we've done, that would enter oral culture as myths. That's where they came from. Clairvoyants were giving visionary recitals of what they saw and what they did. We're not in an oral culture anymore, so it's all written down and people can take it or leave it. But technically, some of the things I wrote about in my books, especially to do with interactions with the Ophanim, are like brand new information. Like if you're a fan of Ganesh, well, this is Ganesh in present time in a different form as a bunch of jokey Marx Brothers type angels who are in charge of the whole light grid. See, that would count as a myth. It's just that we're not a mythic culture anymore.
Right.
That's where they come from.
Right.
The Persians have this wonderful term, the pre-Islamic people of Iran, let's say, a visionary recital. A couple of clairvoyants get together, see wild and crazy stuff in the spiritual world, get together, have a cup of tea and tell each other what they saw, or else recite it to a group of people, a visionary recital. Very cool. Yeah. Sharing. They didn't call them myths, but it's just different language. This is what I saw. Here's the structure of the emerald of the Mount Qaf, QAF. It's a mystical mountain in pre-Islamic mysticism, green mountain and the green man and all the stuff that they saw directly and they can validate the existence of, and they present it to an attentive and receptive audience. Without inflation. It's not like saying, oh, I'm the most amazing person you've ever heard and I'm gifted and blessed and everything. You're just reporting it as a matter of fact recital of events, like an anthropologist saying what they saw in New Guinea.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I feel like, you say we're not a mythic society, but, the idea is that, we love stories.
Oh, the movies are mythic now.
Movies are mythic, but obviously they've been, we fall into the Aristotle or Plato, who came up with the dramatic structure, but that kind of formula, right? The beginning, middle, end kind of stuff. And so it's in our myths now are kind of empty, right? They're shallow. Like we don't have those deep myths that will stand the test of time. And it's just really interesting that, we crave stories, we love stories, as a human, but we don't seem to create the stories that have an impact.
Well, the problem is the three religions of Abraham, Islam, Judaism, Christianity, and modern educational norms, scientific norms, have disavowed that whole realm because they know it leads one into the psychic realm, and they don't want people to go there because then you can actually see who's running the puppet show. And that would undermine the whole control and authoritarian structure of the planet that's been in place for many, many centuries. So it has to be disavowed and ridiculed. Myths are considered artifacts of unsophisticated predecessors of ours. And it's ridiculed the same way astrology and homeopathy and even the notion of conspiracy theory itself is ridiculed to keep people away from it, even though behind the scenes, all of that stuff is real and going full steam ahead. So that's a bit of a problem. The more educated you are, the harder it is to actually approach this because it's not a mental thing. Sure, you have to understand it mentally, but ultimately the myths are guides to experience. And that means you have to experience it in consciousness, and that requires clairvoyance. Otherwise, you're walking in the dark. You can't see anything. It'll be hard. If you can't see it, it's hard to understand what you're doing or where you are. It's no way around it. You have to be able to see it. It's not that hard. Clairvoyance is trainable. And presumably, I wondered about this often because I think, how come all this light grid stuff is invisible for most people? What's the point of that? Well, it had to be the case that originally people were innately more clairvoyant to begin with, without even trying. Had to be. And then there are periods of diminution, either accidental or deliberate or just from entropy. And especially in modern culture, it is disavowed by science, religion, and education, right? And if Joseph Campbell walked into Sarah Lawrence College and said, "You know what, guys, I'm a smoking hot clairvoyant," they probably would have fired him, right?
Yeah, that's true. There definitely is like it seems like society is set up in a way to kind of limit the ability for people to be naturally clairvoyant and to have those naturally intuitive.
Disempowering.
Disempowering, yeah. Yeah, which is a shame.
Well, medicine does it as well. Medicine says consciousness has no bearing on the effect of allopathic drugs or pathologies. Well, that's sort of a lie. It does. But allopathy as conventional medicine has such a stronghold on all medical practices that it seems to be the norm. The consciousness is irrelevant. Well, it isn't irrelevant. It's the creative of everything. And empowerment through the light grid will eventually lead to that as well. That consciousness is at the root of everything.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. One of the things you said in your email was very, very interesting. You mentioned that the basis of geomancy is innate human correspondence per design with the planet's light grid design, thereby enabling effective interaction. Can you kind of elaborate on that a little bit? Well,
people have probably heard what's called one of the Hermetic axioms attributed to the god Hermes, sort of like in the original dowser, you might say. And it goes as above, so below. The structure of the heavenly worlds is matched by the structure of the human. That is what enables astrology to have traction. However, the Hermetic axiom, either on purpose or through deletion, left out a part. It should say, as above, so below, and in the middle too. In the middle too is the earth. So you have three copies of the same design. You have the celestial design, the earth design, the human design. They're identical. Of course, the celestial design has been edited and abridged to suit the parameters of the earth. But in essence, the model of the human, model of the earth correspond point for point to the structure of the universe, or the structure of the original, well, like the Kabbalistic model of the trees of life. So that is what enables interaction. If there was a asymmetry or a disconnection between designs, we couldn't do anything. We couldn't interact with a sacred site or a geomantic node at all, because there's no basis for correlation or alignment. But there's exquisite alignment. That's what enables people, if they do it correctly, to interact with the site and make a difference. Because as humans, we're bearing the same pattern as the planet, and both of us and the planet, bear the same pattern as the original design. That's the basic principle of it.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Well, I think we've covered a lot. I think we're coming on about 2 hours, or actually 2.5 hours or so. If I think this might be a good place for us to kind of, pause and kind of wrap up. Unless did you have anything else you wanted to kind of talk about and bring to the table?
That's a door you don't want to open.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. No, I mean, I got a lot more questions, but I just didn't know.
Okay.
Time-wise, yeah.
I got it. Here's a concluding comment. Part of the covenant that the Supreme Being made with the demographic of souls that were going to incarnate on the earth was that they would take a proactive role in helping to maintain the geomantic integrity of the light grid landscape. In other words, we're supposed to pitch in and help fix the ley lines and straighten the 2x4s in the light temples. Native peoples traditionally understood this. Their rituals and procedures and all that accommodated that approach. Not everyone, the medicine men, wise people, shamans, whatever the categorical term was, but it was recognized that some participation from humans has to be inputted. There's very little of that going on the planet, and unfortunately, there's a lot of interaction that is purely dilettantic. Dilettante is a term that means someone tries a lot of things and don't really master any of them. It's not really the approach you want for interacting with the earth, because it's an engineering proposition. You have to know how things work. And a lot of them work differently, and they require a certain sophistication of consciousness, clairvoyance, as well as education. Just like an engineer, you have to know how the machine works. But putting that aside, the earth is desperate for more trained interaction from people who know how to do it. In other words, who understand it's an engineering proposition. Yes, consciousness involved. Yes, you can call it sacred if you like, but I don't like that term. It's a little precious. I like the engineering thing. It sort of takes that glamour away from it. You have to know how it works, but you also have to be willing to help out. And the earth is very deficient in that. And it's, if anything, should I say, my fantasy is that at some point, President of the United States would establish a cabinet position of Department of Geomancy. I think that would be a fabulous idea, right? Go fix the ley lines, go fix the light temples, organize big groups to be part of the Epiphany and Michaelmas on September 29th and all the other live events, and make sure all the equipment's working and the bad guys aren't messing it up. That's a fantasy, but maybe in 100 years or whatever, it could happen.
Hey, you never know. That'd be amazing. Well, that's awesome. Well, Richard, where can people find you?
Well, I have a email is Blaise, BLAISE at cybermesa.com. I have a website, www, it's all one word, blueroomconsortium.com. That's where they can find me.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I have 35 books out there. You can also find me through the books.
Absolutely. And we'll put this on the description and in the end of this video. So, well, thanks, Richard. Appreciate you stopping by for round 2. I think we've covered a lot, and we've got a lot deeper in our concepts. They're the concepts of your books, and I really appreciate your time.
Thank you for your very intelligent questions.
Thank you.